So the way I see this is we're continuing as part of the conversation that we've been having. And so I wanted to continue down this path of discussing representation. And I want to kind of crystallize what I mean by that even a little more as I proceed. And then I want to take a specific film, at least two iterations of the film. A film that was made as a documentary and as a feature-length film to try to comment about the presentation of Africans. And this was a presentation about Africans by a person in the African diaspora. That's the two films by Ralph Peck on the movement, one from the death of the prophet, and the other just simply titled Movement, which was the feature film. It came out about 10 years after each other. First, the documentary came out first in 1990, and then the other came out in 2000. But I want to talk about those. But I want to work my way up to talking about those by again addressing the question of representation and this notion that something exists that we are representing. In that case, it's very important to know what it is that is being represented. In the case of the categorization of people in societies, it's very important to understand how this representation relates to our notions of citizenship, peoplehood, personal awareness, what it means to be a human being in that particular space at that particular time. So that in a way I am trying to suggest that identity really does depend on how these aspects of categorizing people are represented. And as I've suggested before, my idea of these categorizing people is kind of based in the notion that identity is not based on individual characteristics, but based on shared social circumstances. So the audiovisual representation that I would like to talk about today, I think, is a very important signifier in modern narratives of identity and difference. These narratives are communicated through various types of media, film, various digitized forms of broadcast, something you might call communicasting, which is this idea of social media where people communicate by broadcasting different kinds of information to each other. So in this lecture, I want to focus my comments on the audiovisual narrative as a way of considering identity, as a way of considering the notions we have about race and how these might be related to the ways we think about who is an African, the way we think about Africa and African, and as a way of thinking about the African diaspora and articulations of this African diaspora. This is just a further kind of elaboration So, we talked basically, I suggested this three dimensions of a European narrative. This was very general, but it's very general for the purposes that I mentioned, which is basically that the world was changed by the European century of discovery. And I don't think anybody really denies that the world was changed by the European century of discovery, but it is arguable that the world began at this moment, that somehow what happened here undefined everything that happened before. So even though, this argument maintains that European civilization changed the face of the earth, the world was set on a trajectory in which European society, science, and culture would dominate. The Protestant ethic, the birth of the modern world, all of these things are part of this narrative. That the indigenous population in the New World seemed to have come into its space, or come into this space as a result of its contact with Europe, with Europeans. Same too that the African population, so the indigenous populations all over the world, they come into a space of existence, a space of importance as a consequence of this creation of a European diaspora which interacts with different people in the world. And then the indigenous, and then the African population that was enslaved by the European slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, finds its own existence as a group of people in need of being, in essence, assisted, but they're less than human. Therefore, they're kind of outside the domain of what society is. And so, the next slide. I talked briefly, and this is more of a summary than it is to give you the details of what I said last time. I talked about replacing the European narrative, and I suggested that there are social movements to redefine what it means to be a human. Now, these redefinitions, of course, have also as objective to obtain social position, power, access to resources that exist in the societies that people live in, human respect, all of those kinds of things. And so within this effort, there is the desire to replace this European narrative by debunking the myth of European discovery and the kind of rediscovery of our common humanity and the more rational understanding of history. Here the idea is that for a very long time, the histories of many peoples were not seen as being very important for understanding now. So that if one read history, it was rare that they would be African history or Asian history or the history of these indigenous populations. And so providing a new narrative would require that the histories of these silenced groups, these unmentioned groups, would need to be added to the story. It's not to say that the narrative of Europe is not important, but that it is not enough. And it is not to say that we must only know the African narrative, because it is to say that the narrative as it is presented is too narrow, and it prevents us from understanding what's going on. So that the indigenous populations are humans as well. So the millions of people in Africa, Asia, America, the islands have and express a kind of agency. They weren't just captured and frozen until they obtained an invitation to be independent or to be invited into the line of this European narrative. The same true for those Africans who were enslaved and as a consequence written out of the story of being humans. They were people who needed to be civilized. They were people who needed to be humanized. And, this kind of angle of perspective persisted into the development and articulation of the disciplines at the beginning of the century. We mentioned that over and over again. The establishment of sociology, political science, anthropology, economics, and so forth, Orientalism, Egyptology, that the creation of these disciplines towards the end of the century was a way of saying that if we're going to have something called democracy, something where people have more rights, that the form of governance and the justification for our actions need to be more rational. It cannot just be on the basis of these people are good because they believe in the right religion, or they are good because they come from the right part of the world. Now you had to have a rational justification for why they were, where they were, and who they were. So, in such a way, then, there is these powerful mediums that we want to talk about today, and that is this audiovisual space, where film becomes one part of that space, but there are many outlets where the audiovisual are very important. I remember when I first started working in television in the United States, almost we would expect to have 10 to 20 million people watch the show on television that night when it was shown. But by this last season in July, the idea was that if you got half of that number who watched it on television, that was good, because the way people view digital information, filmic information in the United States has changed tremendously. And almost half of the viewing occurs on the internet, or it occurs on the internet because TVs are getting smarter. It doesn't make sense if it's an object, but that's what they say. You got smart TVs which connect to the internet, and you can look at these programs just like you could on your computer, only you're looking at them in a higher definition. So these changes in technology are having changes in people's behavior, but are also producing different spaces by which the information can be conveyed. So the myth of European supremacy really gets exposed by emancipation and abolition. So there are some very important films that were made to reinterpret this past, this immediate moment, in a context that could justify the persistence of racial exclusion, marginalization, and these kinds of things. One film is a film called The Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was an important film because of its narrative style. Its narrative style transformed how films were being made at that time. W.F. Griffin, who was the director of the film, had an idea about how to tell a story and how to get people to sit in front of the screen and watch the story unfold, and not have the benefit, the texture, the nuance that we get with book, which is where people were usually getting their narrative stories and getting their bank of information on which they could talk about things. But this was a film that basically justified slavery. It did very good in the U.S. market. I mean, it in fact was the most financially successful film in the United States and around the world until it was replaced by Gone with the Wind in the 1930s. So that's for about 20 years. This film was extremely successful. In fact, it was re-released in 1933 as a color film. And again, it had an extreme amount of success. I think made something like $300 million. And making that amount of money, I'm not sure what that is in real dollars, but that makes it a real international blockbuster at a time when it would have only had access to be shown in a few theaters, or it would have shown in all of those theaters as this new technology was kind of taking place. This particular myth of the West was really exposed by World War II. World War II, as we suggested, was a big break. Now, in fact, World War II was mirroring what it was mirroring what was exposed as a result of emancipation and abolition. Because we have to remember, what does emancipation and abolition expose? If it, let's say it's completed when the last country, when Brazil ends its enslavement in 1888. And so if that's a moment where this particular type of enslavement ends, we need to at least pose the question of where did people think they were? So there were many who thought that the successes of the French Revolution, the Revolution in the United States, the onslaught of industrialization in Britain, and the kind of development of rational ways of thinking about human beings, that this was in itself giving a new way of thinking about where human beings were, what progress meant, what civilization meant. And it's pretty clear to me that emancipation and abolition offered a very important reference point, because it's the reference point of freedom. So that all of the rhetoric before then that came out of France, came out of the United States, came out of Britain about what freedom was about was being answered by this act of abolition, by the act of emancipation. Now, Britain officially ended enslavement in 1834, the United States in 1865, Cuba in 1880, or the 1880s, I'm not sure about that date right now in my mind, and Brazil in 1888. So here, this period of time is really the flourishing of notions of freedom and giving that freedom to other people. Now, there is a certain reaction to freedom in all of these countries, so that wherever abolition occurred and emancipation occurred, there was a reaction to it to reconstitute and reinstitute second-class citizenship to the formerly enslaved. This was quite successful, so that the formerly enslaved individuals did not immediately enter into the society as full citizens. And it would take hundreds of years for laws to be changed, for ideas to be changed, before these formerly enslaved individuals would begin to at least have formal legal equality in some of these societies. In the United States, for example, it took all the way until 1966 to implement the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So that's 100 years before the full citizenship of the formerly enslaved was legalized and had the mechanisms for implementation. The protests which motivated this change in U.S. law are the kinds of things that I was talking about. And so this really changed what people thought citizenship meant in that particular space. With World War II, the hypocrisy of the Nazi fascism and the fascism in Italy, fascism in Japan, really made it difficult to sustain classical justifications for colonialism, whether it was justification presented by the British or the French or the Belgian or the Portuguese or anybody else, because all of that all of those arguments about colonialism were mainly that the individuals under colonial rule were going to be offered access to civilization. They were going to be offered a way to move beyond the primitive state that they were living in. So this contradiction was only further amplified when Hitler attempted to implement some of the colonial policies which had been very successful in subduing populations in Africa, and to implement some of those policies in Europe with the colonization of different European countries, whether it was Poland, France, or many other places. And in those situations, the basic mechanism was the infrastructure of those countries was ripped out and torn and used for the benefit of the Nazi war machine. So this particular act made it difficult. If you can't justify doing it in Poland, then you can't justify doing it in Ghana. You can't justify doing it in France, then you cannot justify doing it in Senegal. And you really cannot justify doing it in France, or you cannot justify doing it in Senegal, you cannot justify doing it anywhere in Africa if Africans also participate in the war to end fascism. And millions of Africans engaged in the war. Just as millions of individuals in the African diaspora participated in the fight against fascism on the Allied side, either in the armies of the British or the armies of the United States or the army of the French. And so the hypocrisy of racism and colonialism became extremely clear. I think when you listen to, or you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but then you listen to former First Lady of the United States, Miss Roosevelt, when she gives a presentation at the UN in 1948 on the eve of the acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she articulates and talks about its importance because of it as a response to the lack of freedom that many people on the face of the earth had as a consequence of the tyranny of very powerful countries, and how no longer could it be accepted that because someone had the power, that power would be enough to justify their tyranny. And so justice required an intervention, and in this case the intervention was colonialism. And identity as an element in this process has become increasingly important. Who are we? Towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, identity has become even more so important. Who are we, and what are our rights? If we are part of a nation, how do we get to be part of a nation? Just being in a nation doesn't automatically translate to being part of that nation. And so how do we secure the rights of individuals who are in particular spaces? And this happens at a time where many people are being displaced from spaces in which their identity is settled, and they're being pushed into spaces where their identity is a question. And sometimes they're pushed into these spaces as a consequence of natural disasters, sometimes as a consequence of war among states or war within states. But these large displaced populations are, really challenging what we mean when we think of who people are. It's also being prompted by individuals freely moving about the world as they attempt to find better urban spaces to live and work and find a better life. And as the needs of other countries open up space for people to move in, the very low birth rates in Europe, for example, have been very attractive to people in Asia and Africa. And so millions of people from Asia and Africa have moved to fill the vacuum that has been created by the low birth weights of Europe. Now, Europeans are a little bit upset about this, and their nationalism sometimes dominates their demographic interpretations of the facts. But this very low growth rate meant that they have very few people to maintain the most active positions in society. There's at that level where you need a lot of people to be teachers, to be soldiers, to be policemen, to fill in many of those spaces. You have in fact a vacancy, but a vacancy has been filled in by people from Africa and people from Asia. I mean, I don't know the last time you fly to Europe and you get to the airport and you almost immediately see the reality of immigration. It's not unusual to see the security forces being composed of individuals who are immigrants from Ethiopia or Somalia, depending on where you are, from Senegal, depending on which country you are in. And so these dynamics of movement of human population, as well as the rise of different ideas about freedom and about rights and about how people identify with groups that have been marginalized or excluded from full participation in society. So identity and freedom have been connected in ways that challenge our identities of citizenship, our identities of how we interpret the past. So even the narrative of the societies that we live in are challenged by these individuals who want to assert that their articulations of identity really do challenge the rights that people have and their access to the resources of the society. So the hypocrisy of discrimination in its many forms, whether it's racism, sexism, or gender discrimination, classism, the hypocrisy of it is increasingly evidenced by a reflection on individuals and their access to resources and political power within the societies that they live in. And some of this kind of centers around the rights of those individuals, whether they are immigrants, or the rights of those individuals as they redefine their humanity, as they redefine who they are. So, So I think that kind of puts us in the context of what I want to say about looking. I'm going to use this film as an example. The next slide. I want to use these two films as examples of how film works. But first, let me just say a couple of things. Let me express a couple of my ideas about film. So, film and video are some of the most important ways of communicating today. We talked about how important statistical and quantitative representations of reality were for legitimating our actions in society. And equally important, and maybe even more important, is the influence of film and video. People spend lots of time looking at devices which are presenting them information in a narrative form. That is, it is telling them some kind of story. It can be a fictional story, or it can be a true story. It can be a video of two people attacking one person. It can be a video of a war in a country that is far away that people may have never visited, but they are following that war by looking at video, or mainly it's digitized information which they're being fed. Very rarely are films made with film anymore. The use of film is almost an acronym, because if people do shoot a movie or a film or a documentary or narrative film, feature film, using film, they transfer it to a digital media in order to broadcast it. So digitized information and the distribution of that digitized information has become the major way by which we communicate within this particular space of using video. And it's in this space that, the use of a documentary and a film is a particular way of conveying information. There's a lot of information that we receive in these formats. It comes in the form of advertisements. It comes in the form of the news. It comes in the form of the various sites that people use to get what things they ought to look at now. It comes from various blogs. The death or the near death, the print newspaper industry is in large part a result of how people have begun to shift their viewership, even of these mediums, to looking at them digitally. And it's very rare to find a major newspaper in the world that doesn't have a companion digital space. You still have smaller newspapers, and you still do have print versions of newspapers, but increasingly people are not using those print versions of this information and are depending more so on the digitized versions of this information. So this digital revolution, which really takes off after World War II and is in fact transformed after World War II in ways which you can tell it will end up in this space where we can have private viewing of information. Because you got to imagine that we go from looking at newsreels in theaters, where you would sit in a space like this and you would look at a newsreel. That's how you would get your news, because you wouldn't get it on television, because television didn't exist. And once television did exist, it still mainly was not seen as a personal device. People would invite people over to their home to look at television. So they would come to look at television in a kind of collective way. And in fact, many places in the world, this still happens, where groups of people come around the television to look at a particular thing, whether it's Big Brother or the favorite film thing that people like to look at. It could be a football game. If there's a football game, there's a football game last night, and the community space where a lot of people hang out is down. I stay in a hotel here in Boston, and down there's a bar where there's literally, it's just packed with people, and you can hear every goal, you can hear every mistake, you can hear everything, because they respond like they're at the game. But I gather they come to this collective space to experience the game in a different way than they would get just looking at it on their computer or looking at it on their television. So, this is the way television first was. When it was first introduced, it was much more of a community device than a personal device. It evolved as more people got televisions to being more and more a family thing, and then more and more something that individuals could set in front of, or sometimes parents. And maybe you don't do this in Brazil, would park their children in front of the television. So while they did something, they cooked a meal or had some free time. And their television shows that are modeled to occupy children in these ways. There was one very famous one developed in the United States that's probably been translated and viewed in every language in the world, called Sesame Street. And Sesame Street was geared towards you park your kid in front of Sesame Street, and you could leave them there for literally a couple of hours because it was very intense screening for a kid, because it had elements of learning, but elements of entertainment and elements of intrigue and dealing with their own personal problems that they might be having. And it put all of this stuff together in order to attract the viewership, which is what is done in this particular medium. A message is broadcast out, and is broadcast out in a way which it attempts to capture an audience, and to capture that audience by giving them information which recognizes things about them. That's why for a very long time, films that were made in Hollywood catered to the audience in the United States. And so all of the major films had these themes of the United States and how it was a great place. Many films still have those kinds of themes, but and not so prominently anymore, because most of the money for Hollywood films now is made outside of the United States. And in fact, the major films that are made are often made with the specific markets in mind. So there will be a version of the film for China, a version of the film for Latin America, a version of the film for the Middle East, a version of the film for Africa. And so these different versions of the film are being produced in order to attract the audience in the spaces where they're being shown, so that in fact people are not just watching one film anymore. And this way of broadcasting films, and developing films, and producing films is increasing as the film makers, and still the major place that films are made is Hollywood, although the Nollywood market and the Bollywood markets are increasing. The Bollywood market is in India, the Nollywood market is in Nigeria, and these markets are increasing in terms of the number of people who look to them to give them their entertainment. But they're coming in the market at a time where they already know you have to present versions of films. If you're going to make a major film, that can attract and appeal to different audiences. But this is the medium of making a film and broadcasting that film, is to basically make it and broadcast it in a way which is going to be sympathetic to those audiences. Let me give you an example of a film that I think represents this kind of paradox, if you will. And that film is a film called, the subject of the two films are Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, who was the Prime Minister of the Congo, which is currently Zaire, and he was Prime Minister only for a few months. But his life and his time as Prime Minister were very important commentaries about the end of colonialism and the birth of the Cold War and what that meant for African independence. Because in some ways, African independence was never fully realized. It was a very important movement, I believe, and it had an extremely important result, I believe. But that result and and the success of the result, it was really twisted by the Cold War politics, which really dominated on the African continent. It dominated in the world, and on the African continent, it had a catastrophic impact. Now, in 1990, Raoul Peck made a film called Lumumba, Death of a Prophet. In this movie, he made it in French. He's a native of Haiti, who at the time was living in Belgium. And when he made the film, he actually did not have access to go to the Congo, to go to Zaire. So he didn't have access to the country. He didn't have access to archival footage that would have been in the country if he could have gotten in the country. And all of that was not so important. And for me, it's very important that for Ralph, for the director of this film, authorship and the way of narration were very important. So he took authorship of the film. And this is a real big break in documentary filmmaking, because often documentary filmmakers hide and you don't see them. You don't know who made the film unless you are kind of egg-heady like us. So maybe you guys look at it and you do know, like I know. But you don't really get who made the film by looking at the film. There is the idea that there is a certain objectivity in the documentary, and that the individuals who speak in the documentary are speaking with authoritative voices, that they are experts and they have the right to speak, and what they say you should take as true because they are documenting history as it is, or they're documenting the occurrence of some event as that event occurred. And this is the traditional way of doing documentaries. Ralph Peck changes this in his documentary. He takes a different stance. So he talks about himself. He's the person who is he's the author of the documentary, but he's also the voice of the narration of the film. And he offers a counter-narrative to what the fight against colonialism was about. He offers a counter-narrative to what the battle and what independence in Africa actually meant. And so his narrative, which is quite personal and reflects on his personal life, is a very important element of how he does and presents the documentary. And he uses archival footage to complement him telling what happened. Now, mainly there's a lot of stuff that's simply not in the film, which is a very interesting thing because it's a really good documentary. But it's a lot of stuff that's not there. Patrice Lumumba is not there because Patrice Lumumba is dead. There's not a lot of archival footage about Patrice Lumumba during his prime ministry, nor is there a lot of agreement on even what happened. So there's the absence of truth in the articulation of the documentary. So he doesn't say, I'm going to tell you what happened to Lumumba. He tells you, I'm going to tell you that this guy, this is the circumstances by which he experienced all of these things. So there's really a documentary of something that is not there, a kind of documentary of the absence of Lumumba, the absence of the truth, the absence of the history. And basically telling a story that offers the importance of Lumumba because of what Lumumba represents, because the lack or the absence of independence, which is reflected in the very production process that he uses. So here he goes to make a documentary about a country that he can't visit because the violence is too intense, and he's going to make it about a person who is not there, and he's going to make it without the actual records in order to do it, and he's going to tell it about a history in which he is not very certain about. And that's in some ways a big power of it, because African independence was an idea of freedom. It was an idea of freedom that was really not sustained. That is, the freedom of African countries did not attain after independence. And one of the biggest obstacles to that was that every country that became free on the African continent, every leader was given the same kind of questions and tasked with the same kind of conflicts that Lumumba was. Whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to be on the side of the West and capitalism, or are you going to be on the side of the East and socialism? And Lumumba kind of walked down a middle line in which he said, I will take support for whoever wants to support our cause and to do it in a way that's advantageous to us. And his colleagues in Ghana, his colleagues in other places, in Ghana and Guinea, and his big supporters in those countries were already considered as very much leftists who were open to the influence of of the Soviet Union, which made them an adversary of the West. So the fact that Nkrumah was then Nkrumah was overthrown in Congo in a very brutal way. His body today has never been found, but the individuals who were involved in his murder have admitted that they were involved in his murder, from the individuals who were the CIA agents to the individuals who were the police or the military police from Belgium. So we know that these people at least profess to have been involved in the death of Lumumba. So in some sense, it represents that interference from abroad in the affairs of Africa. In the film Lumumba, which was released 10 years after the documentary, the narration in the film's fictional film, the narration, and it's a fictional film of the last 3 years of Lumumba's life, which were the first 3 years of independence, or the month before, and then the 2 last years of independence in the Congo. It is narrated by Lumumba. So again, this giving of a voice to a person who was absent in it. And here Lumumba is narrating the film to the end. He narrates his own death. He narrates the rise of Mobutu, and the rise of Mobutu occurs after his death. But he narrates his death to the moment that the bullets are seen to go in his chest. And he narrates the guys cutting his body up and throwing it into the fire pit in order to be burned. But again, he's taking the idea of authorship and he's presenting it in a very interesting and unique way. And he's trying to tell the story which provides a counter-narrative to what we traditionally think is the way to tell a story about Lumumba. Now, both of these films lack something which is standard for films made on Africa. And you probably cannot recall a major film being made on Africa, not being made by Africans, that does not have basically a white person in the film to resolve the problems of the film. And you get this in all of these films that are made on Africa. You think of any major film you've watched on Africa that hasn't been made by an African, or wasn't made by somebody like Raoul Peck. This was one of the big reflections, because this is the reflection of Hollywood, is you have to have this resolved, because then there is forgiveness, and the forgiveness is because you had somebody who was good, who was responsible for the problem, but they were good and they helped resolve the problem, which then twists the narrative in a way that Peck twists the narrative in a way which leaves some things about it unresolved. So if Lumumba is killed by the United States and the Belgians, and now we know that, what does that mean for the Congo? Well, it probably would mean a very different thing for the Congos. Now, the name of the Congo went from Congo to Zaire to back to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so we would probably be thinking about this issue very differently if the turmoil that is in the Congo did not exist. So that real kind of relationship between what we get from this kind of narrative, the significance of it, and what role it plays is really diminished by the fact of the real life situation of the problem of the problem of what is actually happening in the world relative to Lumumba's legacy, relative to African independence, and relative to the Cold War and the Cold War space on African independence. So films which come to then represent reality, and if we were then to ask the question that we asked in the beginning, what is it that is present and being represented to us in this film and in this documentary? So the reason I like the film, I like both of the films, is that what they do is that they basically say what was present, and what I am representing to you is the hypocrisy of independence, the hypocrisy of what the implications of the Cold War were for these individuals who were not the main combatants in it, so that the West, and you could include in that the Soviet Union, were fighting over turf in Africa, and the impact of this was catastrophic for Africa. I'm going to stop talking there, and I will entertain questions that you might have. And talk about the other films that we showed. Talk about films I'm working on, films I've worked on, projects, non-fiction and non-fiction projects that I'm going through. I'll stop now. Thank you very much.